you to the CFPR for inviting me to speak, and thank you, Puk, for the very kind introduction. Today, I'm taking the opportunity to present some work in progress. This is research that I just wrapped up data collection on, where I explore issues relating to work-life balance, the care regime, and gender and class inequalities. Most of the work draws on about 100 interviews, 100 in-depth interviews I conducted between 2018 and 2020. So I just wrapped up these interviews last month, actually. And the interviews have primarily been with working parents. And so, you know, this is very much work in progress because I just finished data collection. So I look forward to your feedback. I thought that today, in the time that I have, I will briefly sketch out one particular piece, an article that I'm working on, in which I explore the analytic value of approaching education as a form of care labor. And I will begin the talk just with a very brief discussion of how scholarship has tended to approach the work-life balance problem, followed by a couple of key empirical findings, before I end with a discussion of how thinking about education as care labor can help us approach the work-life balance problem in productive ways. Okay. Second slide, please. So the issue of work-life balance or work-life reconciliation, yeah, both of these phrases, of course, are used. The issue of work-life balance has received a great deal of attention in scholarship. And in the literature, one of the most obvious problems that receives attention relates to the care needs in the first few years of children's lives. So early childhood care, that is preschools and childcare centers that are serving children from infancy to about 6 years old, is a focal point. And scholars highlight this as an important component in care infrastructure from two main angles. One is that preschools fulfill the needs of very young children for constant adult supervision, and therefore they free up parents to do paid work. Secondly, preschools also fulfill the need for children to acquire the skills that are necessary for later academic work. And so it's also an important site for mitigating class inequalities in home learning environments. So the focus on schools as part of the infrastructure of care is typically limited to these years of early childhood. And beyond the preschool years, as one would expect, given that most children's developmental needs and dependencies, of course, are reduced as they grow older. So schools' functions as care institutions also recede into the background. And so when scholars talk about schools beyond the preschool years, it's usually conceptualized in terms of education and is more frequently theorized and considered separately from the analytic lens of care. Yeah? So it's thought of as an education problem rather than as a care problem, or an education institution rather than as a care institution. And the people who study education then are often a different set of scholars who are not specialists necessarily in the study of care regimes. What I'm essentially arguing here today is that the Singapore case provides a counterpoint to this way of temporalizing care needs and parents' care labor. While it is true that most children's physical needs are much reduced from the ages of 7 to 12 compared to when they are infants to 6 years old, parents in Singapore regularly mention primary school challenges as central to their experience of work-life balance and the adjustments that they make in wage work. In other words, while primary education is not generally considered by scholars nor from policy perspectives as part of care infrastructure, they are part of parents' own calculations of their care obligations. And primary school lives shape the choices parents feel they have regarding managing wage work and parental duties. Primary school lives affect the decisions that families make around employment, around household division of labor, around family expenditure, and parenting styles and strategies. Indeed, where childcare centers and preschools give care in ways that replace parents' care labor, primary schools seem to generate care labor and responsibility for parents, compelling them to rethink and to reorganize their paid work. Now, this is not to say that Singapore parents are not challenged during the early years of parenting. They talk longingly about sleep, the way hungry people talk about food. They worry about illnesses and developmental milestones. Working parents lament their lack of time to play with their kids. They struggle with having to take time off from work when children are sick and cannot be at childcare centers. So the early years of childhood, no doubt, are very challenging for work-life balance. But for many parents, especially those who are middle to high income, the combination of three conditions in the Singapore context have increasingly spread out the labor of care that is so intensive in the first years. First, grandparent caregiving. Second, the availability of low-cost privatized care through the labor of foreign domestic workers. And third, in recent years, the expansion of subsidized childcare facilities. In contrast, in the primary school years, grandparents and domestic workers come to be adequate only for ever-shrinking parts of what children need. As parents, and especially mothers, come to see education expand into a key component of their care responsibility. So as children move into primary school, in other words, the parts of care that can be replaced, that can be done by grandparents and domestic workers tends to shrink. And instead, new forms of labor are required, new forms of care are required. And parents, especially mothers, come to see education as a key part of their care responsibility. So schools, which in earlier years patched care gaps, filled the care gaps, turn into generators of new care needs. And parents across class lines see as their key task and responsibility ensuring that their children keep up with school's academic demands. The Singapore case illuminates a dynamic now common in many wealthy countries and especially cities. So looking closely at education as a challenge for work-life balance allows us to pick up where the literature on care regimes stop. Education's challenge to work-life balance is usefully conceived as a care regime problem because it allows us to draw on the insights of scholars who have drawn attention to social policy and to the significance of gender and class, both as a cause and as effect of variations. And drawing attention to education needs as part of care labor highlights the ways in which social policy outside of those conventionally associated with care also matter. I'll come back to this point later on, because I think that this approach of thinking about education as care work can help us see the problems relating to work-life balance more clearly. So before I loop back to that, let me just give you a little taste of some of the things that I found through my interviews. Next slide, please, Rabia. I'll just give everyone maybe a minute to read the quote because I won't be reading it out loud. Okay, so today I wanted to sort of just present kind of two broad themes, yeah, in terms of what I found. And the first set of themes has to do with time pressures, routine lives, and the salience of primary school, okay? So working parents face immense time pressures. This, I guess, is no surprise to people. I asked my interviewees to describe in detail their routines on typical weekdays and weekends. And most people had mapped out schedules and routines that they know well and try to operate within. There was a great deal of structure and routine driving their days. And so when you talk to parents, you get the sense the rhythm of everyday life for households where there are working parents and school-going kids is very steady rhythm and very relentless rhythm. There is often a feeling of rushing from point to point and task to task with very few breaks between. People spoke very regularly about feeling pressed for time and rushed and stressed as a result. In some instances where this was possible, given family financial circumstances, hectic schedules were the main reason for women eventually quitting or cutting back on wage work. In other instances, it was experienced as a challenge to be endured while children are young. Time pressures seeped often into weekends as various needs of the family that can't be met during weekdays, like errands or housework, enrichment activities, or socializing with extended family or friends. These things that cannot be done during weekdays are often crammed into the 2 days of the weekend. Very significantly, hours spent with school-going children after work centered on helping with or checking children's homework. From the ages of 7 to 12, as most children become more independent and capable in terms of taking care of their own physical needs, they also become more dependent on parents where schooling is concerned. Interestingly, parents with children younger than primary school talked about anticipating life becoming more challenging when their children go to primary school. And parents with children older than primary school look back on the time as a period when they had no life. Yeah, and this is what this particular respondent, whose words I reproduce here on the slide, was saying, that she was actually looking back on the time when her kids were younger. And parents with children in primary school at the time of the interview spoke like they are living in the eye of the storm. Yeah. In other words, one of the things that I found from talking to parents with kids of different ages is a consensus around the primary school years as the years when they have to play major roles in their children's education. And there was a very strong sense that this is their parental duty, perhaps their most important duty during that time of life. So this quote that I put here was of someone who was in her 50s and had 3 kids near adulthood by the time we met. And she was recalling for me how she felt like she had no life and she was very stressed out when her children were in primary school. A few things to note about her response. First, like her, many of the respondents I spoke with actually did have other caregivers in their lives, sometimes domestic workers, other times grandparents. Most of the parents I spoke with were also in 2-parent households. I included some single-parent households in my work, but for the most part, people were in 2-parent households. But even for people with a care network, with grandparents or domestic workers, with partners, even for people with a care network, they regularly told me that the particular labor of supervising homework cannot be given over to other caregivers. So that's one thing to note. Second, mothers were far more involved in this labor, as well as this responsibility, compared to fathers. Mothers also tended to be far more involved in housework and coordinating households than fathers. So the primary school years tended to be a particularly intense stage for mothers. Third, my interviewees, as you can see a little by this quote, referred very specifically to streaming and examinations as a key orientation of their worries. I won't be saying very much about this today, but that was certainly one of the big themes that people really talked a great deal about, and had a lot of angst around streaming and examinations. Finally, as you can sense from this quote, people talked very often of feeling stretched and fatigued. Yeah. And again, something that I won't be talking about very much today, but that I think is important and interesting to think through is people's sense that family life was deeply affected by this, and that there was very little time for family life outside of these demands. Next slide, please, Rabia. So a second set of sort of themes that I wanted to say a little bit more about that actually kind of follows from the first point is around the theme of duty and sacrifice. Doing these interviews, I was regularly struck by the strong sense of duty and personal sacrifice embedded in how parents talk and think about their lives. Ensuring that their children can keep up with primary school was very often framed as a key duty of parents. And mothers in particular took this on as a central part of how they think about what their long-term strategies should be, what kinds of daily habits they have and try to cultivate, as well as their identities as women and as mothers. Now, what does it mean to say that primary school is parental duty? What does it look like in practice? I propose thinking about this as involving 3 dimensions or 3 layers of practice. The first is embedded in the rhythms of everyday habits. A second that we can think of in terms of familial political economy. And a third dimension that considers the long-term and complex entwinement of lives of adults and their children. So let me first say a little about the first point, everyday habits. So in terms of everyday habits, what does duty look like? Yeah, in everyday habits, parents spend their evenings making sure their kids have done their homework, and where they can, meaning where they have the capacity to help their kids with the homework. The actual labor is often unpleasant and not very pretty. Parents readily admitted that a lot of what they do on a daily basis is basically nagging and scolding. They talked about being impatient and frustrated, about losing their tempers, and about shouting. Parents with primary school going kids forego their own leisure and rest on a regular basis. And I think one of the really interesting things that I heard in what people say was, when they're talking about their daily experience of time, is that sometimes they would refer to me time. Yeah, and it turns out for many working parents with children who are in primary school, what they think of as me time is time spent at work, or time spent running errands, or time spent commuting. That is their me time. Yeah. So you do get a very strong sense of time pressures on an everyday basis. So the frustrations involved in this first layer of dutiful practice lead to a second layer of practice relating to what I'm calling familial political economy. And what I mean by this is that there's a strong sense of duty, the strong sense of duty shapes various decisions about who does what and how to use resources in a household. And here I saw parents spending time, energy, and money to garner resources around their children's schooling needs. This takes the form of sometimes partaking in chat groups and forums to gather information, attending workshops to learn about the contemporary syllabus so that they can teach their children, as well as, of course, hiring tutors. And parents weigh costs of services as well as opportunity costs involved in cutting back on wage work. Yeah. Unsurprisingly, there are variations here in terms of what parents in different class circumstances are able to afford to do. But there was a great deal of convergence in terms of the significance of children's primary school education, the significance it plays in shaping families' practices, decisions, strategies around type of wage work, work hours, schedules, and budgets. Finally, and relatedly, I think it's important to consider the long-term and complex entwinement of adults and children's lives. The strong sense that doing well in primary school is parental duty triggers among parents major decisions about their own lives. Mothers in particular reorient their own needs and aspirations. Some shift to part-time work or quit their own jobs. Many more elect to take on work roles with fewer responsibilities. And in this way, many sacrifice their financial independence, as well as alter their sense of self and sense of accomplishment in both the short and long terms. Many men, on the other hand, face increased pressure to be earners in a societal context where costs of living are rising and work has become more precarious. So in both the short and long term, the practices that are triggered in service of children's school needs have effects on how gender is experienced, how gender manifests in the family for both adults and kids. It has effects on the financial well-being of households in the short and long term. And it also has effects on the ways people think about what family is, what childhood should be, as well as societal success. Yeah. Okay. Last slide, please. So I started off by saying that in the literature on work-life balance and care regimes, schooling beyond the preschool years is not typically included in sort of thinking about care regimes. And I started also by saying that the Singapore case implies the necessity of seeing primary school as generating care needs. So let me end this presentation by returning to this briefly by thinking about what can be gained when we think of this part of children's life course as generating care needs, generating care labor. First, the very rich scholarship on care regimes identifies gender inequalities and gender imbalances as a major problem. Some of the solutions to mitigating gender inequalities proposed by scholars have to do with addressing care needs via public institutional mechanisms. So enhancing childcare centers on the one hand, and on the other hand, improving the rights of both mothers and fathers to take paid time off from wage work. Yeah. What I've found in the Singapore context in some ways compounds the problem of gender inequality. And I think it compounds the problem in at least 3 ways. First, it extends the number of years in which children are dependent. Yeah. Second, it further solidifies the distinct roles ascribed to men and women. And finally, the gendered norms and patterns that accompany families' practices around children's education have long-term consequences for further separation between men and women's financial status and therefore social power. So thinking of education as care work, I think we have to pay closer attention to the ways in which gender shapes pathways and familial practices, and the ways in which gender norms solidify through these layers of practices. A second thing that the care regime literature emphasizes is that class variations can create big variations in families' experiences of work and family life. Here, the Singapore case too indicates the importance of class, but in ways that involve not just the nature of employment and the potential mitigating effects of care institutions, but also the private investments and opportunity costs so deeply embedded in parental duty and childhood. Finally, the comparative scholarship on care regimes identifies how, in different national contexts, there are variations in the degree to which care is taken up as public problems requiring public solutions. And in general, scholars have emphasized the importance of public investments and institutional infrastructure that can replace parental labor. The Singapore case points to the importance of also looking at public institutions as not just generating care solutions, but also producing new needs for care labor. And the particular constellation of public and private turns out to trigger, paradoxically, highly uniform standards and orientations, but without accompanying social support for resolving the care needs that follow. Yeah. Let me end by just saying this. I've been very interested over the last 15 years or so in exploring the meeting points between private intimate lives and public social dynamics. And I've been very interested in trying to understand state-society interactions at the site of the family. And when I look at how things have changed or not changed over these 15 years, one thing that has shifted quite a bit over these years is public investment in early childhood education. And there has been quite significant expansion in institutions, public institutions of care. Yeah. Yet, this expansion has not been accompanied by significant changes in things like marriage and fertility rates or patterns of employment of women and men with children. So, you know, I think this audience might be particularly interested in the Singapore case, of course. And so the question does need to be asked, why? Yeah. Why is it that given those expansions, some of the social outcomes have not necessarily, do not necessarily indicate that people can make very different decisions around work-life and work-life balance? So the piece I just presented today, I think, offers a piece to this puzzle, yeah, a way to think about how it is that primary school education has created, yeah, these new challenges and these new care needs that imply in some ways a kind of like increase and enhance importance of gender and gender inequalities as well as class inequalities. I'm going to stop there for today, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, You Yenn, for a very interesting presentation. We got a few questions here. Since we don't have too many questions, so I would like to invite Hui Jo to ask questions. If you could unmute yourself and turn on the camera, then that'd be great.
Hi, Professor Teo. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's very, very interesting. So my question is, I was more wondering what kind of views that when your participants do the interviews and saying that they have been reducing and even quitting their workload for family's sake. What kind of sentiments do they present? Like, do they feel like they are more vulnerable now because they are not contributing much financially in the family in comparison to their male, I don't want to say male partners, but it's like in partners in general. Do they have such like certain sentiments?
Yep, thank you for that. Yes, I think that for the most part, I mean, I think there are a lot of interesting things that come out of these parts of the interviews. People talk about the choices they make sometimes in very ambivalent and conflicting ways, meaning they feel ambivalent as well as a sense of conflict. Yeah. I think this comes from a bunch of different places. One is that although they feel strongly that their parental duties should take priority, the reality is that people also draw a lot of meaning from their lives outside of family. Yeah, and they draw a lot of meaning from their work. And this is the case not just for professional women who have careers, but women across the board, that people do have their sense of self and self-worth tied up in the work that they can do, right? And so quitting is often not an easy decision to have made, not just for money reasons, which I'll come to, but also for these reasons of a sense of accomplishment, a sense of self, a sense of selfhood that is separate from the family. Yeah. But money is also very important, and quitting has a lot of consequences for essentially women's power in the family and women's power in the household. And often my respondents were very cognizant of this. Both respondents who have maintained wage work as well as respondents who have quit wage work. Yeah, I think, so women talked a lot about how they like not having to ask for money. That's very important, that this came up quite a lot, that not having to ask for money gives people a sense of independence, right? Very, very importantly, also women's money, and this is found in lots of other research as well, yeah? That when women have money, they also tend to spend it more on children. And so the people, both the women who have quit or haven't quit, talk about how having money allows them to to buy things for their kids, and very interestingly, to spend money on kids' enrichment and tuition. Yeah. So not in all the cases, but in enough cases that I think this is something that I'm going to try to tease out. Women talked about how they and their husbands sometimes disagree on the importance of tuition and enrichment. Yeah. With women generally being more in favor of it as necessity. Yeah. And so there are instances where if the couples cannot come to agreement on whether or not enrichment or tuition is a necessity, where women who do have their own income are able to say, okay, even if you don't agree, I'm still going to do it. And because I can pay for it, the husbands don't intercept, they don't go any further in terms of blocking the decision. Yeah. So having money allows women to go ahead with some of these important household, well, what they feel are very important decisions for their kids and for their households.
Okay, great. We had lots of questions now, so I would like to ask Joan Ryan to ask your questions and share your comments. Joan, is she there?
Yeah, I am. Sorry, Mike, I need to turn on my camera. There we go. Hi, so thanks for this presentation. You know, I think you brought some really interesting observations about education actually being gendered care work. So I kind of want to know a little bit more about that, because I find the fact that education of kids falls onto the women by default, it's pretty, it's not a pretty obvious mechanism to me. So I guess, you know, I'm wondering if there's some sort of differential between the couple and educational attainment, where say the father might be more educated or you know has a more advanced degree, then would that actually make a difference in terms of who the educational care work falls onto by default?
Yeah, that's a good question. For the most part, as we know, no, actually, I won't say that. For the most part, it is women who take on education as their care responsibility, meaning that although the men I interviewed also from time to time talked about education, they rarely talked about it in terms of needing to cut back on wage work in order to fulfill this need. Yeah, so it was almost entirely women who think of education and their work as in conflict, right? As having deep sort of, how should I say, contradictions that are hard to reconcile. I mean, the contradictions, a lot of it is really around time, yeah, and around the need for time to do this, right? And the time can be time, as I mentioned, you know, spent actually checking the homework or supervising the homework. It can be time like sourcing out tutors and finding the right, you know, tuition centers. It can be time spending trying to juggle the children's schedules, right? But for the most part, this is women's labor. That pattern is fairly, you know, I say it's very, very strong. This is women's labor. This is almost taken for granted as women's labor. All of those aspects are taken for granted as women's labor. So the feeling one gets is that it doesn't have to do very much with who has more capacity to teach. Yeah, in some cases it does. In a few cases it does. But for the most part, you know, it's not as if most parents are teachers and really know how to teach very well. Yeah, and most parents will openly sort of admit that actually it's very hard to do, right? But it is still primarily women who take it on as their role and their responsibility to sort that out. However it is you're going to resolve it, whether it's by attending workshops or by you know, sitting down and nagging your children, or by trying to outsource some of it through you know, hiring tutors. Whatever those tasks are, you know, it is primarily women who take it on. And as my answer to the previous question indicates, it is that difference is so pronounced in terms of accepting it as women's work, as mothers' work, that including sort of who spends money, whose money goes into children, and whose money goes to tutors and enrichment, even that, you know, has a gendered dimension to it. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess because, you know, I think, you know, I do believe that there's definitely a gender normative with the women kind of assuming this sort of work, but I kind of wonder how strong it is. So say if it's a couple where the father just happens to be a tuition teacher or an MOE teacher by trade, you know, if the gendered norm is still strong enough to overcome that, such that the mother actually still assumes this sort of teaching duties.
Yeah, I probably need to look through, you know, some of those interviews to see, you know, to see about those specifics. But the pattern overall is strong. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You know, I mean, meaning that, of course, there will be certain exceptions, right? Meaning, of course, there will be certain exceptions where, you know, in that particular couple, you know, it's the reverse. Yeah. But the exceptions don't prove the rule. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, next is Professor San Lim. Can I invite you to ask your question?
Hi. Thanks, Yo Yenn, for your presentation, which really resonates a lot with me as not just a parent. Literally, I got my life back after my two kids finished their PSLE, but also very much as a scholar. I'm at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. I actually, a lot of what you wrote and spoke about resonates with what I had discovered through my book, Transcendent Parenting, Raising Children in the Digital Age. And what was fascinating for me when I was looking at the whole issue of homeschool conferencing between schools and parents was that very often I think schools actually have a practice of taking down the communication details of both parents. But eventually when the teachers migrate the conversation to the WhatsApp chat or to the homework helpers and so on, it will invariably be the mother. And so the mothers then get very involved and very drawn into the whole parenting, education, care labor, even more intensely than they otherwise would be. And fathers, in fact, will say, "Oh, I have no time for that," you know. And I've always felt that this is something that the policymakers aren't sufficiently cognizant of, because if in fact they want to talk about how they want to have parity in parenting, even these very sorts of subtle practices need to have some light shone upon them. So yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, thank you, San, for that intervention. I think that, you know, the more general point that you raise here is that at the individual level, the kinds of choices and decisions and practices people make always intersect and interact, of course, with institutions as well as larger social norms, right? And so there's a way in which some of the gendered patterns get bolstered or get repeated and strengthened precisely because the ways teachers interact with parents take on certain gendered patterns as well, because parents presume this about each other as well. So, you know, for example, lots of WhatsApp chat groups exist, right, around kids, and, you know, the parents of classmates tend to form chat groups and things like that. And it very often is sort of mothers who are partaking in those, right? And you can imagine in some ways, and this is also what some respondents say, that they're more comfortable talking to other mothers, right? So mothers talk to other mothers. So mothers become more and more, I suppose, well-versed and immersed in the world of what needs to be done, right? And meanwhile, fathers in some ways don't get included into those social networks as easily, right? And so over time, of course, they also become, in a way, have less capacity, or they don't develop the kinds of capacities, you know, expected of sort of parents, yeah, participating in their kids' work. And as you point out, schools too, you know, the way schools communicate with parents also indicate their presumption of who the primary parent is, right? Who is primarily responsible for the kids, particularly when it comes to kids and school. So there's certainly quite a bit of this kind of, you know, individual couples may want to behave differently, but they of course live in within this larger kind of constellation, right? Where there are strong presumptions about who does what and who should be doing what. Yeah. And over time, particularly at this stage, as women cut down on their work, I mean, this is a thing that then sort of intensifies the unevenness, because as women cut down on their work, and precisely because they cut down on their work for their children, right? Explicitly so, ostensibly so, they made certain decisions for their children. Then, of course, you can imagine within that couple's dynamic, they've already decided somebody needs to step up in terms of wage earning and somebody needs to step up in terms of caregiving. And there are now very specific persons, you know, and very gendered persons, right, who have to do that. So again, over time, once women make, once couples make that kind of decision in their households, the difference between what women do and what men do increases.
Okay, Hushu, please.
Hi, You Yenn. Thank you so much for your enjoyable and thought-provoking talk. I have a few comments or maybe questions. My first question is about the time dimension. So we know that the streaming was introduced in Singapore in 1980, and the new policy is to abolish it in 2024. And based on my interactions with a couple of Singaporean friends, when they were young and going through the school system, it doesn't seem to be the case what we are observing now parents are doing when they were young. So I'm just wondering, the phenomenon you are studying and talking about today, is it, so what are the historical forces underlying this change we are observing? And do you foresee the abolishment of streaming will actually help to kind of reduce the pressure parents are feeling during these primary school years? My second question is about how the social class plays out in Singapore. Annette LaRue was working on the parenting style social class in United States. And based on my understanding of the China context, for educated parents in urban areas, they are practicing those cultivated, concerted cultivation. But for many rural parents who themselves, they have a lower educational level. So, and on the other hand, they have to, many of them, they are migrant workers to support the family economically. So there's no way for them to practice this kind of parenting. So I'm just wondering how social class plays out in Singapore, because based on the interview data you have shared, it seems like it's a universal thing in Singapore. And the other question I have is about the cultural element. I'm wondering if this primary school years generating care labor for parents, is it specific to East Asian parents? I mean, East Asia, including Singapore, where there's a very competitive education system and there's a cultural tendency emphasizing academic performance. So yeah, just would, yeah, these are my questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Hushu. Those are all excellent questions. I'm not sure how to go about answering them. Okay, let me try. First on streaming, I think that the move in the last couple of years and the next couple of years is towards what's called subject-based banding as opposed to outright streaming. But the actual, or maybe the word streaming is not going to be used as much anymore, or hasn't been used so much in contemporary context, but the actual dynamic and mechanism actually remains very similar, which is that the strong logic within the system to want to sort and separate, yeah, by a narrow set of criteria, using exams as a way to identify you know, students who fit in the different groups, that dynamic is still very strong. So it may be called different things, and there definitely sort of changes and evolution of that. But I think the reality of sort of things being very high stakes, a huge exam orientation, and then a very strong logic towards sorting, these principles remain, yeah, and have stayed fairly, in some ways, fairly consistent over time. So your question, in some ways, is a very interesting puzzle as to how it is that, given this has been true for, you know, 3 decades, why would it be that parents today behave so differently than parents, you know, 20 years ago? Yeah, that's part of what you're saying, right? And, you know, I think one of the reasons is that the sense of the kind of strength of the competition, in the sense of the what's at stake, has become more palpable to parents today. Yeah, the sense that because we live in a pretty unequal society, and a lot of that inequality is tied to the kind of employment people have, and the kind of employment people have is tied very tightly to the kind of credentials people have through education. Parents can see it's a high stakes game, you know. So both parents who are university educated as well as parents who are not university educated, you know, now will say openly and in a fairly sort of definitive terms that now a university degree seems basic. What do they mean by that? It means that they can see that without it, a lot of doors are closed, right? It doesn't mean that all parents think their children can go to university, but that is one of their deep hopes, because they feel that if their children can't do that, life is going to be difficult, right? There's a book called, what is it called? I think Love, Time and Parenting, or something like that. That's by 2 economists. And they essentially, the central thesis in their book is that if you compare countries and how much sort of this kind of very involved parenting happens, you will see some correlation between how unequal countries are and the level of involvement in children's lives, particularly where education is concerned, right? And I think that that's really resonant in this case too, that parents can see that in a highly unequal society, you know, people are gonna have to, their kids are not gonna have it very easy, and that as parents, their responsibility is to make sure that they help them as best they can. Yeah. Now this gets me, I think, to your question about class and how that differs in terms of the actual practices. And of course, the practices do differ. Yeah. And the practices, today I've tended to emphasize the similarities across class lines because I wanted to emphasize, I wanted to put across, you know, that this kind of feeling that this is a parental duty is true across class lines. Yeah. It doesn't mean that the practices, it doesn't mean that all parents have the same capacity to do so-called what is necessary, right, to ensure children's educational success. But all the parents, you know, across class lines think of this as a very important part of their role. Yeah. And here is where the fact that this part of care is so privatized and so dependent on private resources is going to create huge differences in outcomes, right? So the obvious one is around tutoring and tuition and the ability to essentially outsource. Yeah. And that variation, yeah, in what people are able to spend is very high. And the differences in outcomes is also therefore pretty high. Yeah. So definitely there will be parts of my work where I will look more deeply at what are some of these inequalities that are produced through the fact that primary education has become so important, as well as through the fact that although public schools and public institutions exist, so much of how well kids do or don't do in the public system depends on the private resources parents have. Thank you for your questions.
Okay, now that we are, you're talking about class, may I invite Irene, who also had some questions about class differences. May I invite her to ask questions?
Hi, I think it's okay. We have time. We can give the time to other people because I think You Yenn largely answered that question.
Okay,
Thanks.
Irene.
Great.
Hi.
Nanzon, Agnes, do you have questions? I mean, you said you had a question. Do you want to ask your question?
Sorry.
I think it's
Sorry.
is the person previous to me, I think.
Yeah, I'm in front of.
Okay, Lin Son, yeah.
Yeah, I have to go in a couple of minutes, so sorry. I have to do it briefly. Thank you for the very wonderful presentation. I learned a lot. It's very interesting. And I'm actually very interested in how the parents, like parenting, their style right now, especially because of the education system, will have an impact on students. And then I think that the society is actually changing very fast, but the parents and the whole education system is still like honing students for like getting great remarks. And then now the parents are getting more and more anxious about getting their students into the right universities. But then I wonder if their anxiety will be transmitted to the student, and then will like the mother's involvement, because I also see my friends doing the same thing in China. And then I have a feeling that actually this kind of anxiety, or like parents practices now on students, as you said in your presentation, that they are doing mostly like scolding and not nagging. Well, that really helps students to prepare for a like ever-changing future. So I wonder if like the parents right now, their investment in this kind of education might not help the students in the future as they hope they will be. And another comment or reaction I have, when you, at the letter of your presentation, you said that now we have more and more facilities helping the parents or helping the family to do the education or stuff like that. But it looks like the birth rate is not on the rise, right? Is that what you said? So I wonder if it has to do with the perception of the parents' cost of raising children. It's not only about money. It's all about, it could be about like, if I didn't raise a good quality children, will they be able to survive in the future, society? So I'm wondering if this part plays into that. No, I'm afraid of that I won't be able to be a qualified parent and really raise good children. So I would rather not, or like I would only have one child or something like that. So that's two of my reactions, and I would like to hear your thoughts.
Thank you very much. Those are all really good questions too. Let me start with the last, about what you said about whether people think about not having children because they feel they can't raise good quality children. I think for the most part, people don't articulate it quite that way, but they do, like I said in the presentation, because people have such a strong sense of what their duties are supposed to be, that they're mindful that being a parent is a huge responsibility, I think. Yeah. So the people who are already parents, I think, feel this strongly. But I think one of the things that may be interesting to think through, possibly through other people's research, not mine, is how the social scripts around how difficult primary school is and how expensive it is to raise children have an effect on how we think about childhood in contemporary Singapore, right? And therefore has an effect on how young people who do not have children think about marriage and fertility, right? And the picture that I think is often painted, if you know people who have kids, is that family life is tough and revolves around, you know, looking at homework, right?
Exactly.
And so there is, I think there's an empirical question to be asked, yeah, about what these norms that are generated, how these norms shape, broadly speaking, how we think about, you know, what childhood is or what family life is, and it can shape people's aspirations.
Yes.
Yeah, but I do think that's an empirical question and not really something I can sort of definitively answer. I think in a lot of my my interviews, what I've noticed among the way people talk about their kids and what they do with their kids is that there's a strong sense that they have no choice, and there's a strong sense of frustration. Yeah. And there is actually, as you point out, quite a lot of recognition that the way we are raising our kids has an impact on kids that is not all good. Yeah. So I can't speak directly to your question of what do you think the impact on students are, but I can say that the parents themselves are very cognizant of this. So I hope I didn't come across as saying that, you know, these parents that I talk to are all trying to get their kids to be A students. That is not what I'm saying. Yeah. And there are, of course, such parents, and there are parents who openly tell me they are tiger moms, right? But that is not the majority by any means. Yeah. So again, like my emphasis has been on duty, because I think people see that, you know, like they're dutiful, but it doesn't mean that they want their children only to be, they require their children to be the best. Yeah. But in talking about the pressures they feel to ensure their kids can do well in school, I did get a strong sense among parents that they are worried about their kids' well-being. They are worried about the stressfulness and the pressures of the school system, right? And so although they are duty bound to do what they can, they also have this kind of conflict, right? In terms of thinking about what would be too much. Yeah, and their parents will worry a lot about what would be too much. And so parents talked quite a bit about hearing of youth suicide, for example. Yeah. And about kids not liking to, don't like to learn, for example. Yeah. So they articulate those kinds of worries. And there's often this sense, I mean, again, this is something that I really want to develop more or think through more, you know, that people are working with different kinds of moral equations in some ways, and sometimes those conflict, meaning, you know, they have certain values around education's importance, but they also have values around it's important to be good people, right? And it's important to be independent. And so they also want their kids to have those other things, but sometimes those values feel to them like they're not easy to kind of reconcile. You know, they want their kids to be generous and kind towards others, but, you know, what they're required to do in the schools are to be, you know, sort of more competitive and inward looking, right? So, you know, I think parents are cognizant that there are these different aspects, right, of a person's development that are important and they wish to see. And it's not easy as parents to reconcile those.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
All right, so we're going to go over time a little bit. So there are 3 more people who would like to ask you questions. So Agnes, please go ahead and keep your question brief.
Thank you, Prof TEO. And actually, my question is more like a comment. And I think it's quite interesting to know that you put education as a kind of care labor. My question is about how about the very young children, for example, the age before 3. Maybe it is still too early for them to go to kindergarten. I would like to know, because I don't know much about the early child care services in Singapore, for example, for the age before for children aged before 3. So I would like to know whether those care facilities are private or public, or whether it is all affordable for all the families. If not, if the care facilities are not affordable to all the families, will there be kind of class inequalities?
Yeah, great question. I think that in that part of the life course, like I mentioned earlier, there's certainly been great expansion of care institutions, preschools, and childcare centers over the last decade or so. Yeah, great increase in numbers, including increase in sort of semi-state linked type facilities, right? And therefore facilities that are fairly affordable. Yeah. There's also been expansion in subsidies that are essentially means tested, meaning subsidies that are sort of different levels depending on a household's income, so that broadly speaking, most people can access these centers. Yeah. However, precisely because there is a mix of private and public players in the early childhood sector, there is also quite a lot of variation in terms of the kind of, how shall we say, in some ways pre-primary preparation that children will have, and there will be certain kinds of class variations. Yeah. In terms of kids' preparation for primary school. It's a little bit of how should I say, the preschool sector and what's happening there, and the sort of huge variations in price and quality and type of education is linked very much to the logic of the primary school system. Yeah, meaning if the primary school system was not the way it was, with very high expectations of kids when they enter primary 1, yeah, with a very strong sense that exams are coming quickly and that kids have to be up to speed, you know, in those 6 years fairly quickly. If parents were not cognizant of that, the preschool sector, I think, or the preschool world, I think might look a little bit different. Yeah. But part of the kind of sensitivity parents have towards different quality preschool education is partly driven by what they think primary schools are going to require of preschool kids. Having said that, I think that that part of life is where there are more variations along class lines in terms of how parents think about, you know, how prepared and how good, yeah, the kids need to be.
Does that answer your question, Agnes?
Yes.
Okay, great. So I think we'll wrap up with one last question from Nomala. So thanks so much, Yu Yenn, for your time.
No problem.
Please, thanks for your patience. Appreciate it.
Hi, Mala.
Hi, Yu Yenn. Just a quick question, following up on actually the last thing that you said, or you know what you were implying, you know, in your concluding statement. You know, the fact that the childcare, having a lot of childcare doesn't seem to help things, right? So you need more than I mean, that's what you're saying, that a lot more is needed than you know, having childcare places available. So, you know, my thing is observing, you know, the women's movement in Singapore has been going on for a long time. So nothing has, I mean, not much actually has changed. You know, I remember going to uni in my 20s, now in my 60s. So that's at least 40 years later, and I feel like the change as far as gender role is concerned is so small that it's actually not very significant. So we can't, you know, I mean, I don't want to sound depressing, but you know, you can't help the feeling that there isn't the will, right? There isn't the state will for it to change, because, you know, I mean, as long as the country is doing economically fine, that's okay. We can go the pathway of Japan, Korea, you know, gender role remain the same, but the economy is booming. So my thing is, what would you, if you had to advocate or say where, you know, what are the things that must change and why this change must happen? Could we hear a bit about your thoughts about this?
Sure, yeah, thanks. I think I've also been surprised in doing this work at the kind of, as you put it, the slow rate of change in terms of gender roles. You know, I mean, in quite a few of my field notes, I remember writing down like I can't believe I'm still here, you know, talking about the same thing, and I can't believe that I'm interviewing people, you know, some of them now significantly younger than I am, who have in some ways more traditional forms of division of labor in their households compared to mine, right? And but maybe this is not a completely fair assessment, partly in that, you know, I can see and detect, you know, certain shifts in people's aspirations and desires, right? Meaning that within couples, you can start to see that it's not, you know, the fact that people feel conflict and feel that something's not quite right, yeah, implies that they do see that there should be or there could be different ways of handling this situation, right? And so the problem is that they run up against sort of a social context that doesn't allow them to really fully exercise a range of choices, right? And that's why they feel stuck. Another way of saying that is that, you know, the actual men and women living these lives don't necessarily think that this is the only way to be a man or this is the only way to be a woman, right? But they come up against sort of a context that makes it very difficult to not follow that script, right? And I think that changed, or that sensibility is not, we shouldn't completely, I suppose, dismiss the importance of those kinds of sensibilities, yeah? And those sensibilities come about precisely because enough has changed in, you know, education parity, right? So that women and men do have a different way of thinking about gender or about their own possibilities, yeah? That someone in their 30s today compared to someone in their 30s 20 years ago, you know, does, you know, there has been shifts in the way they think about some of these things. So the issue then really is about sort of figuring out what in the structure needs to change, right? Or what in the social context needs to change. And I think the focus on early education, early childhood education in the preschool sector has done some things in terms of allowing people, allowing women in particular to stay in the workforce, right? But if the problem of working becomes more intense, not in those early years, but in later years, then I guess what I'm saying is that we need to look at what's happening in these later years, right? And we need to be thinking through how is it that children going to primary school causes women to quit their jobs? Because, you know, once I say that, that should sound irrational, right? We are losing a lot of talent. We're losing people who actually have worked enough that they're very, you know, they have great and rich experience to bring to bear in their work. They can contribute strongly to society in those ways. I'm not saying that women who don't work are not contributing. Of course, they're also contributing in important ways to society, right? But, you know, if people could make choices that actually suit their families, we would see probably more households making decisions where it is men who cut down work rather than women who cut down work. Because it's not the case that in every couple, they think, you know, the men love to work and the women don't love to work or anything like that. Yeah. So it could be that there is more of that kind of range, right, for people to make decisions that actually work for their families. The other thing is that one of the things people, women particularly talked a lot about, is that there's no good quality part-time work, as well as that there's discrimination after they've taken time off, right? So there's also stuff to be done trying to, or ensuring that people who leave the workforce for whatever reason, yeah, whether it's caregiving for children or caregiving for older people, whether it's women leaving or men leaving, that people leaving the workforce can come back, right? Because again, it's that inability to come back that then makes it a much sort of larger opportunity cost than it has to be. Yeah, children grow up; they don't need parents forever, right? And so but having made some of those decisions, people find it's a road of no return.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think, you know, looking closely at what the education system is doing and what is demanding of parents and what is demanding from kids and the cost it exerts is one part. Looking at kind of employment and the structure of employment is the other part. Yeah. Looking at wages certainly is actually a whole other thing that you know, I will also be exploring in my work.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Yu Yenn, and thanks everyone for making this a very engaging session.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, I have a few more questions that we won't be able to get to, but we'll make sure that we'll send you those questions in the chat box. And
thank you, that would be great.
Leaving comments for you. And one of the comment is, when is this paper going to come out?
I would like to know the answer to that too. Yeah. I will. I don't have a date yet.
Okay, someone already wants to cite it. Okay.
Oh.
So thanks so much, Yu Yenn, for your time and
thank you, Paul, for this.
Yeah. Right. So this is our last seminar of the year, but we'll resume our webinar series again in mid-January. So hopefully you will join us then too. So until then, please stay safe and goodbye and happy Diwali. Bye.
Thank you.